Hello, I'm Juliet Mann, and this is the Agenda podcast, CGTN Europe's one-stop shop for smart, in-depth discussion of the issues that really matter in the world today. For nearly 2 weeks, the UK witnessed the most violent social unrest in more than a decade, triggered, it seems, by the far-right's reaction to the murder of 3 young girls at a Taylor Swift dance class in the town of Southport. The violence spread to almost 30 towns and cities, with shops looted, hotels housing immigrants and mosques attacked, and hundreds of people arrested. So what does this really say about the state of the UK, a matter of weeks into Keir Starmer's premiership? And what really is the role of online disinformation, which many are blaming for the extent of the violence? Joining me now are Griffin, Emeritus Professor of Modern History at Brookes University, Babu, former Chief Superintendent of the Metropolitan Police, and Bale, Professor of Politics at Queen Mary University of London. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us on the agenda. Roger, let me start with you. There have been hundreds of arrests, many people charged, police officers injured, businesses torched, places of worship and immigration centres attacked. Why have these riots generated so much momentum, do you think?
I would argue that if you bore down into it, we're dealing with a stratum or a social group spread throughout largely cities and inner cities in Britain who are permanently disaffected from the country. These are people who experience all sorts of forms of social deprivation and problems with housing and health and education. And they are, especially when they're youngish males who feel deeply disaffected with their future and have lost hopes of conventional ways of rising in society, are easy to seduce into picking scapegoats, easy targets to explain their real sense of despair. And it makes them fodder for right-wing radicalization of various degrees. Though I would like to add that really we're not talking about sophisticated ideological radicalization necessarily. There are forms of violence which went on in the last few days which have very little ideology in them, and which is much more to do with vandalism and expressions of negative violence without any real political aim.
Tim, where do you think class fits in here? I mean, many of the rioters would certainly consider themselves to be white working class. It's a group that feels forgotten by the political class, doesn't it?
Well, that's certainly a narrative that has been pushed for some time by politicians on the right of politics, even though, generally speaking, they don't like to get into questions of class when it comes to the distribution of wealth in this country. I think there is a feeling among some people in that white working class bracket that they have lost out somehow to people who have come into the country more recently, whether that be EU citizens who came in after 2003, or whether that be people from West Africa, East Africa, people from South Asia as well. And I think there is a strong undercurrent, I would say, of Islamophobia here as well. It's not the case that I think the vast majority of people in this country have a problem with Muslims, but there is quite a lot of stereotyping that goes on, particularly, I think, after the attacks on September the 11th, about Muslims being kind of alienated from Western culture, not integrating, not fitting in. And I think that feeds into some of the violence we've seen being directed, as you've already said, at mosques.
You mentioned September the 11th. I don't want to go as far back as that, but I do want to talk about 2011, because, Del, that's when you were a chief police officer, and that was when there was widespread civil unrest across the UK following the shooting by police of a young black man, Mark Duggan. How would you characterise this situation? How different is it? And is it more worrying?
Well, 13 years on, we have the internet that has dominated this disorder, because people have been able to spread lies. We have a euphemism of misinformation, but effectively it's lies. When those 3 young girls were murdered, the rumours that spread on the internet, deliberately, maliciously and falsely, was that this was a Muslim suspect, and he was a person who'd recently arrived in the UK via a boat, and he was an asylum seeker. All of that information was incorrect. It was somebody who was born in this country. It was somebody who was from a Christian family. And the reality was that the far right, and I think Tim's point there around Islamophobia is very, very pertinent, because one of these triggers to try and get the far right supporters out in their masses. I think the other thing to bear in mind is in Britain, we do not have a definition, a government definition of Islamophobia. There has been absolute resistance from many quarters to even have a definition of Islamophobia. We have a definition of anti-Semitism, but not Islamophobia. So I think you have the internet, you have a group of white working class men who, and these are men who feel that they're able to deliver a high level of violence. But we've also had significant cuts in policing. The austerity that the whole world has suffered from has resulted in huge cutbacks in public services in the United Kingdom. And we're only now in the position of turning some of those roles. So a quarter of all the police officers who are working in the UK have less than 5 years experience. So there's a whole number of factors that have contributed to the difference between events that happened 13 years ago in 2011 and the events in 2024.
So there are social aspects here, there are political aspects, also economic aspects. But Roger, I wonder what you think that the last few weeks is telling us about multicultural Britain. I mean, some, like Nigel Farage, the leader of the right-wing Reform UK party, says it's evidence of community relations on the edge. Is the UK at boiling point?
Well, of course it isn't. But it is a part of a very well-established right-wing narrative in every country in the world that society is about to collapse. If you go back to, in Britain, to Enoch Powell or Margaret Thatcher talking about invasions and overflowings, and right through to Braverman, you've had messages from established political parties, but far more so on the ideological extremist right. You've now got a total rhetoric that has been established since the war about multiculturalism as an experiment, as a failed experiment, it being somehow imposed by a globalizing world. You have the idea that institutions like the United Nations or the EU are somehow trying to destroy nationhood, destroy racial purity. You have right-wing extremists in Germany talking about a white genocide being carried out by non-German, non-Aryans. It's just a newspeak for Nazi rhetoric. So it is part of the far right, and I would call it the really misguided conservative right vision of democracy, that somehow multiculturalism is a failed experiment. And I'm afraid people like Farage and Braverman and Elon Musk, etc., have been feeding into this narrative and indirectly fueling the legitimacy of the extreme right-wing narrative. And it's a really disturbing element of established politics and of extremist politics.
We'll talk a little bit later on about how famous names, celebrities, wading in on this can be helpful or less so in a moment. But I want to pick up on something that all of you have mentioned, and that is the complicated economic background that there is right now. I mean, the UK, like much of Europe, and indeed the rest of the world, it's still suffering this cost of living crisis. Tim, how do you think that plays into this latest social unrest?
Well, it never helps, clearly, but I don't think we want to overdo the extent to which the drivers of what's gone on this summer are economic. If you look at the UK, although our growth rate is pretty poor, and although productivity is pretty poor, actually employment is at a very high level. There aren't lots of people unemployed in this country. Clearly, the cost of living has put pressure on people's household budgets. You'd also have to say that, as Dahl was saying, the austerity imposed on this country since 2010 has led to a diminution of local services. And I think that is particularly relevant when we're thinking about the young people involved in these riots, because if you look, for example, at the number of youth workers or youth centres that have closed since 2010, that is a really serious problem and something that this government, I think, is going to have to deal with.
What is very clear is that immigration is a huge issue in the UK and right across Europe, and it has been for quite a long time. What do you think needs to be done to address that by Keir Starmer and indeed by other European leaders?
We've had a failed attempt by the previous administration to try to find this a solution of deterrence by threatening immigrants with deportation to Rwanda. It's very heartening that the new Labour government has refused to go down that path and has cancelled that project. But I do think this is going to be the big one. Starmer, in my book, has responded very well and very successfully to the challenge that emerged overnight a week ago. But the real test of his government is to see whether he can actually find some concrete policies of integration. There are a whole load of measures involved with greater cooperation with European police forces, with the idea of creating the possibility of legal migration with application centres abroad, etc. But for me, the key is that if after 5 years Britain has become a more equal society, if there has been, to use this terrible empty phrase, genuine levelling up, if fewer people feel threatened, if fewer people feel that they have to defend their turf, their territory, then I think that a lot of the knots that have been created by the problem of immigration will untie themselves. We are a country with an ageing population, and like nearly every democracy in the world, we actually need a workforce in a whole range of sectors. And I think, I'm hoping that eventually the people who are natural xenophobes will be so marginalized and so put in their place by a rise of civil society, which we've seen so hearteningly in the last few days, that the problem will it won't go away, but it will be seen not as us and them, but as a broadening of our human obligations and human rights.
Tim, I wonder if you agree with that, not just for what's happening around the UK, but let's broaden it out a little bit to what we're seeing around Europe and what we've seen in the recent EU elections across the Channel with the rise of the far right.
Yeah, I mean, clearly it is the case that far-right parties have done well in some countries. It's important to recognise that in other countries they've actually gone backwards. So I wouldn't want to overstate this as something that is necessarily sweeping across Europe. And you would have to say that in most countries, far-right parties do seem to have a kind of ceiling of around 15 to 20%. But nevertheless, clearly, for example, in France or in Italy, they are a big force. And in Italy, the governing force, and in France, potentially, the governing force. I mean, I think if you look at some of the drivers of support for those parties, it does have to do with these cultural narratives of dispossession, of replacement, and that is something that, to be honest, the centre-right parties themselves have probably failed on. They are presented with a dilemma, really, when it comes to the rise of the far right. Do they try and isolate it? Do they try and keep some sort of cordon sanitaire around the far right? Or do they try and suppress demand, if you like, for far right parties by adopting some of the rhetoric and some of the policies of those far right parties themselves? For the most part, I'm afraid, that Conservative and Christian Democratic and to some extent Liberal parties on the continent have chosen the second route. So in other words, they have tried to suppress the far right by becoming, if you like, ersatz versions of the far right themselves. So going very, very hard on immigration, talking a lot about the cultural problems that multiculturalism supposedly causes. But that hasn't worked. All that's done is legitimise some of the critique, some of the narrative from the far right. But people still seem to prefer, to quote Marine Le Pen, the original to the copy. So I think centre-right parties in particular, but mainstream parties generally across Europe, have a responsibility to stand up to the far right, but also actually to frame a narrative about immigration and integration, which is a lot more positive. Because I think people do take their cues to some extent from what mainstream politicians are saying. So while I don't want to deny that there are problems clearly caused by immigration and integration in the short term, and while I don't want to deny that the far right is doing well in some countries, I wouldn't want to issue, if you like, a counsel of despair and say that, this is inevitable and there's nothing we can do about it. We clearly can. It's very important that governments clearly show their populations that they can control their borders, and that's difficult nowadays, but it can be done. And it's also very important that those governments actually tell the truth to their populations about some of the trade-offs that Roger's already talked about. So in other words, the fact that European countries are growing older and will need more younger workers over time means inevitably that some immigration is going to have to take place. While there are going to be problems with prejudice, etc., if people are told the truth, generally speaking, opinion polling shows that people are willing to be grown up about this and willing to kind of balance things.
Let's talk now about perhaps some of the key buzzwords that have emerged from this social unrest. Digital disinformation. Roger, what's your take on how that has fueled the fire, as it were?
There's what I would call misinformation from people like Elon Musk. I think Farage's misinformation is because he's an inveterate misreader of the political and cultural situation of Britain. But I don't think he's deliberately trying to do misinformation. But I think the most disturbing form of misinformation for me is what's going on in chat rooms between people in social media, which doesn't actually need input from deliberate perverters of truth, such as Tommy Robinson, because in a way its dynamic is autonomous. It feeds off itself. So even though, and that actually means that any attempt to address legally or in some sort of juridic framework the problem of misinformation is actually really complicated because there's not a single source. I don't know if Dal would agree with that.
Dal, I wonder what needs to be done then to prevent that kind of fake news from being spread online. I mean, Prime Minister Keir Starmer has said that online misinformation laws will be looked at in the wake of all of this social unrest. What would you like to see being done?
So I think the internet is a significant difference to what's happened in previous disorders, because bad actors will. We talk about misinformation, but essentially lie. Bad actors will lie, and then those lies will be in echo chambers and spread around by people. So if you go back to the catalyst for the present disorder in the UK, where we had 3 girls tragically murdered, horrific situation, and the lies that were spread was that he was a Muslim and who had recently arrived from on a boat. Now, all of that information was lies. People decided that they were going to spread it. In fact, they even put a name out for those that information to be spread. So I think we have to bite the bullet and accept that big internet companies are not going to be able to regulate themselves, and they will need legislation. So I think what we need is for governments, and this is governments across the world, to actually accept that actually allowing unfettered access by these internet companies to their communities is creating a danger of allowing extremism to flourish and allowing that extremism to have an opportunity to speak to lots of different people without it being checked for fact.
Social media could also be powerful in getting the counter message across, the anti-fascist message out there too. I mean, Tim, let me bring you in for this one. I wonder if maybe the far right is better at harnessing its power and sending its message. Maybe they're better at it.
Well, I mean, there is some evidence that perhaps they're more active. But then again, if you look at what happened at the back end of this past week, you would have to say that those who mobilised against the far right and brought actually thousands of people onto the streets also use social media in order to be able to do that. And of course, social media is also a powerful tool for governments as well. That is in some ways why governments find it so difficult to tackle, because on the one hand, you know, they would like a little bit more control over what goes on. And as Dahl says, they don't really want completely unfettered free speech. But on the other hand, they realise that social media can be a very powerful tool for themselves to communicate with their publics and communicate, you know, if you're a political party or a government in a democratic country, with your voters. But I think Dahl is probably right to say that, you know, the era of the Wild West, if you like, as far as social media is concerned, is probably coming to an end, because governments around the world have realised that actually the big companies are not really responsible. In fact, they have a cash incentive, if you like, to whip up stories and to get people excited so that they stay on those platforms longer, and therefore, you know, they can sell those eyeballs to advertisers. And I think really the time has come now for democratic governments around the world to think seriously about taming some of these companies, maybe even breaking them up and making them smaller, but at least actually making them financially liable for some of the stuff that goes on there.
Could I just throw in a couple of points?
In a nutshell.
Well, one, if social media didn't have a great democratic potential, which was demonstrated, for example, in the public revolution against the autocratic government in Egypt a few years ago, then it wouldn't be a common practice of autocratic regimes all over the world to try to control social media. So social media is ambivalent. Nearly everything in the modern world has two aspects. The other is that one of the most enlightening articles I've read, and this is where I use, if you like, social media, but I certainly use the internet. Byline Times, which I hadn't come across till today, has published today a very interesting and extensive article on the role of social media and of influences from the Trumpist right across Europe to the Danish populist right on the events of last week. And it's a really interesting example of how in the modern decentered, deterritorialized media world and social media world, actually there is a wonderful chance for better information and more civil solidarity and standing up against forces of evil. I just think we all need, I mean, I'm afraid an older generation of academics like me, we're just not up to speed with the new forms of knowledge and thinking and fighting back. But it looks to me as if in Britain last week, some very idealistic young and middle-aged people did use the new resources in a way to hit back against the enemy, if you like. When I say the enemy, I'm not trying to demonize it, but the enemy of democracy and racial harmony.
I want to talk about how communities are pushing back. Dal, in the last few days, we've seen some really quite heartening and quite extraordinary behaviour from a growing number of ordinary people, and it's kind of dampened down some of that far-right violence. They've been coming out to do clean-up operations. We've had all kinds of communities, all kinds of ethnicities doing that. Do you think, is that more a Britain that you recognise?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen extraordinary levels of generosity and coming together. £250,000 has been raised after the racist far right burned a library in Liverpool, one of the most deprived areas in the country. We've had GoFundMe sites raising tens of thousands of pounds for mosques that have been attacked by the far right racist groups and business. And that money, then the mosque has decided that money goes to local businesses who've been destroyed by the far right's rioting. So that does fill me with a great deal of confidence. I think when I was growing up in the 70s, it was the norm for people who looked like me to be attacked going to school. We had our windows broken. My brothers, my dad, sisters were attacked going to work, getting on buses. I remember conversations at home where the family would talk about who had been attacked by right-wing racist skinheads. So it's a pretty horrific time if you looked like me growing up in this country. Now, fast forward, 30, 40 years, my daughters are totally oblivious to that kind of behaviour. So it was a shock to many of us in this country that you had far-right racist thugs who were trying to, let's not mince words, they were trying to kill people in hostels and hotels where asylum seekers were staying. They were setting fires to bins and blocking the fire escapes while there was people upstairs looking in fear at what was happening, and the police were trying to protect them. So I think what we see, it's a bit of a wake-up call to all of us, and the need for us to not take social cohesion and the way we live in this country. And I think one of the facts that I find fascinating as the world changes across the entire world is that white people make up 18% of the population. 82% of the population are people of colour. And as we become a smaller world where people will move from place to place, there are many people who struggle to understand that the world is changing. So there is something about educating people to understand how important it is to value and appreciate different communities, different cultures, because the world is shrinking. So if you look across the world, the world is changing, and people have got to start embracing it and understanding it and valuing it and expecting, and as opposed to trying to stop it happening. It's a bit like people trying to stop the inevitable.
Dal Babu, Tim Bale and Roger Griffin, thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Remember, you can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also find more agenda content on CGTN Europe's Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Telegram and YouTube channels. Until next time, goodbye.
The most interesting questions.
Are there other living beings beyond Earth?
Will man or machine be in charge?
Great question.
Always have more than one answer.
Well, hold on, let me just draw up a list.
And always come from more than one person.
That's where the credibility lies.
The concept of having a machinery which is alive and evolving didn't wait for us.
The end of inequality of incomes and wealth around the world, can you imagine how difficult that is at the moment to achieve?
Every episode, Stephen Cole, Murray Beveridge, and some of the brightest minds out there shed light on the answers to some of the most intriguing questions.
There are two ways of looking at this.
Machines can't really discriminate between civilian and military targets.
The Answers Project.
Maybe we need to just look at this in a bit more detail.
Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
The Answers Project, a new podcast from CGTN Europe.